Trivia question for you. We all tend to want to be writers. We all want to write our first book. But what one action can you take that proves you're capable of writing your first book? Well, the answer is simple. Write your second book. Let me tell you a little bit about how writing my first book actually happened. Um, we're going back some years ago, so this book was written before the turn of the century, which shows how long ago it actually was. But at the time, I had written a whole bunch of short stories, and I'd written 5 books before this, but none of them actually good enough to ever actually be published. They were the kind of books that you wrote and you threw them in a drawer somewhere. So I decided I was going to write a book. I was going to write a really good book. And so a couple of things going on during this time. Like I said, I wrote a whole bunch of short stories. I was writing a lot of comedies, humor stories, some really ridiculous stories. I found I was actually pretty good at actually doing that. And then I had this kind of twinge of wanting to write, mystery, suspense, and espionage fiction. At the time, I was basically about to join the military. I was at West Point at the time, and so I decided while I was at West Point, I was going to write a novel. And because I was at West Point, I had so much extra free time on my hands. That is a joke. I had zero free time whatsoever. But after I got out of the academy and I was actually in the regular military, I started thinking again about writing. And so this time I went, okay, I have a story that's been in my head and I've been thinking about it for years and years. And so I decided maybe it's time to sit down and actually just crank this thing out. So, well, a couple of things were going on. Like I said, I was in the Army. I was actually overseas. I was in Germany. It was kind of a good tour. And everything was going out fine, except I spent a lot, and I mean a lot of time out in the field. So there was a lot of serious downtime where I didn't have anything actually to do. So basically, I would spend time reading, which is about the only free kind of time you actually had, other than regular military kinds of things. And you're up for many, many, many hours. So during this process, I started formulating the idea of what this novel was going to be. And so at the time, I had this idea of this kind of not espionage, but more a mystery suspense involved in with corporate intrigue. So there's going to be a murder that took place, and then a mystery as to how it actually happened. And the way it kind of started was all of these different ideas of who this person was, um, the corporate structure behind what this guy was actually doing, and then kind of like a humorous element to it because I never write any, or at least I had never written anything that really took life seriously. Almost because life at that time didn't really feel all that serious to me. I mean, even though I was doing serious things and all that sort of stuff, I just kind of decided I'm going to have a little fun with this. And so I kind of, he had a lot of asides and a lot of things kind of going on, but he was an interesting character. And so a lot of the side characters that got created into the story became pretty interesting as well. And so it was kind of like a lot of fun to actually write. And then as the writing process for it kind of came about, what I discovered was it really wrote itself. At least it felt that way. And so I sat down for many, many hours and just kept writing. And it was one of those where this is the early days of even before the internet. And so that's how long ago this was. So I decided I had used a software called Leading Edge, which was one of the first word processors available. Microsoft Word was still way off. We weren't ready for it yet. Microsoft Windows wasn't even actually around yet. And so I sat down using this program called Leading Edge, which allowed me to take, typed information and put it directly onto the screen. One of the problems with Leading Edge, which um, fortunately other software programs fixed in the years that came later, was if you didn't save it at the very end of your writing, you lost the whole thing. It basically scrambled everything, and you literally had to save it at the very end to get what you wanted. So it wouldn't go back to your last save. It would literally be, if you didn't save it, you lost the whole thing. But that was all you had available to you. I think WordPerfect was one of the newer ones that was coming around the corner. And so I wrote the book. I had literally written 150 pages of it, and I had printed out, used to print out right after I, typed up for the day's, work. The next day I would come in and I would edit it, and then I would print out after I edited it. So I had 150 pages sitting on my desk. Didn't think anything of it. I mean, and I wasn't really thinking of what I was going to do with this when I was done with it. It was just, this was something I always wanted to do. I was, teachers when I was a kid used to say, this guy's going to be a writer one day. And so I took them up on it, and I tried to become a writer. And so basically I had 150 pages done. So then the weekend came along, and I should probably explain a little bit about why I was writing during this period. I was in Germany, and you had a choice of two things to do. I wasn't married, but the thing was, when I got to Germany, they said, "Are you married?" And I was like, "No, I'm not married." And they're like, "Well, how the hell are you here?" But I had a lot of time to write. But also, the majority of the people went out and drank. It's literally all you do as a soldier. And I was part of a unit that their sole purpose in life was to have one mission and die. Not the greatest mission in the world. We're kind of like a special operations group. It's not really part of what we did. That's for another story. But anyway, the problem was, people were living pretty much life to the very edge because they weren't planning to come back from whatever our first encounter ended up being. And so I didn't like to drink. I hated drinking. I mean, I did drink from time to time, but mostly I would go out and everybody would be drunk around me, and I'd be like, this isn't really fun. So that's why I started writing, because I had that extra time to kind of play around. So anyway, going back to my story, so I wrote this 150 pages, had it printed out, and was doing fine. And so I literally had about 60 pages left of story to it. And on the weekend, what happened was I got into this writing fit to where I cranked it out like you wouldn't believe. And I mean, the last part all the way through, the great conclusion and the story and the epilogue, and well, I don't know if there's an epilogue at that time, but the story was just so perfect, and it finished, and it was great. It was the best thing I'd ever done. And so I finished it, and I was like, the end. It was like, finally finished, and then the power went out, and I lost everything. Now, keep in mind, the first 150 pages was on one disk, but because of the size of discs at that time, I had to go to a second disk. That second disk was where the new file was. So I literally had started the brand new file on, 151 going forward. But I had lost all 60 pages of it, and I was so pissed. And so I finally decided, okay, forget it. I was never meant to be a writer. This was a useless exercise. It was good to know, and it was fun to go through the whole process. I did finish, so I succeeded, and we're done. And so I decided I was never going to write again, and I was pretty much it. And so went back to units, started going basically out and getting drunk again. About a week or two kind of goes by, and I got called into one of the higher officers' offices, and he was like, "Mr. Gunner, we need to talk." And I was like, "Oh crap, what did I do wrong?" I mean, Was I getting too drunk after they, decided to start doing that again? And what it turned out is he goes, no, I'm wondering what happened to the rest of your novel. And I was like, what are you talking about? I mean, 'cause I never gave it to anybody to read and didn't even really tell anybody that's what I was actually doing. There's a few people who knew, but, it wasn't a big thing, People had their own things going on. And so what I discovered was he had actually been sneaking into my office every day after work and reading whatever I had written before. He was literally into the story. So he told me at the very end, he goes, Mr. Gundrum, I know I really can't order you to do this, but I want you to finish this novel. It would be really important to me to see the ending of this. I was like, well, sir, I can tell you what actually happened. No, I want you to finish it and tell me and show me what happens. So I literally sat down there it took me about another 2 or 3 weeks of actual writing every night. I couldn't do it in a one night shoot like I did the last time. And I finished it. And I printed it out kind of like the same way I was doing before. Didn't even tell him I did it. I just put it on my desk and he read it and he never said a word about it. And I was like, that's the weirdest thing ever. But that's how I finished my first novel. And so I think it was like a really important, significant point in my life. And so I was convinced then and there, okay, I was a writer and I proved it by writing a novel. And the problem is you don't really know that you were successful because there's this whole belief that people have in the background of their head whenever they're writing, especially when they've written their first novel, is, you know, was I just one of those guys that had that one novel in them, that and churned it out and that's basically it and we're done. There are some authors who are actually like that. Like a good example is Alice Sebold, who wrote a brilliant book during her time. But the problem with it is the Lovely Bones is what I'm talking about. Great book, but the thing was, as I read it, I kept thinking to myself, I would never read anything else she wrote. I mean, I love this book, and I think it was one of the greatest things I've ever read. But I don't think she's designed to write books. And turned out to be the case because her second book fizzled and died, at least according to the difference between the two. And I kind of saw that from the writing itself, but you could see there was a rawness to it that was really good. And there are people like that. And I thought maybe that was me. Maybe I was one of those kinds of people, even long before I'd ever read anything by her. I was going to have one book, and that was it. So I sat down and started writing my second novel very shortly after I finished the first one, completed it the second time. And I wrote that, and it was a book that eventually became called Leader of the Losers, which is a completely different story, science fiction and all that, but I finished it and then kept finishing other books after that. And so 16 books later, I'm kind of convinced I can finish a novel. But anyway, that's my story of what it was like writing my very first novel, and why if you're ever thinking of writing a first novel, all I can tell you is just do it. Sit down and write it. Because, I mean, there's no way to know whether or not you can do it until you do it. And most people will talk about their novel or talk about their writing. I've mentored a lot of people over the years in writing. And one of the first things I notice when I'm mentoring somebody is sometimes the people I have mentored and just dropped off the side of the road are the people who they really want to be writers and say they want to be writers, but they don't write. And so my advice to you, if you do want to write your first novel, finish your first novel. And then, like the joke was at the very beginning of this, if you want to know if you were capable of writing your first novel, write your second one. because then you know, and it wasn't just a joke. Because then after I wrote my second novel, I went, it wasn't a fluke. It was real. It was meant to be. I was meant to be doing this. So take that to heart. And hopefully you too will sit down and start writing books. Like I said, I have read so much work by so many different people who want to be writers who have contacted me, and I've talked to them over years as to whether or not I would mentor them. And I love helping out people who, have promise and have actually are willing to put in the work. Problem I've kept running into over the years is I've run into a lot of lazy people or people who claim to not be lazy, but they really were. And that's the hardest thing about writing is actually writing. So sitting down and actually doing the work that you need to do. Um, it doesn't always mean it's always going to be great, but sometimes it is. And sometimes you don't expect it, and it turns out to be so much better than you ever thought it would be. So thank you for watching my video, and hopefully it was helpful.